Welcome to the Congressional portion of our Candidates Forum, presented by the League of Women Voters of Winnebago County, the League of Women Voters of the Ripon area, and Oshkosh Media. This event is being simulcast on 101.9 Oshkosh FM Community Radio. I am Kathy Propp, Winnebago County League of Women Voters, your moderator. The League of Women Voters seeks to inform citizens about candidates seeking office. We do not support or oppose any political party or any candidate. Joining me on the panel for this forum are Winnebago County League member Frankie Mengling and Ripon area League member Gary Wetzel. Yes, men are full members of League. Thank you, Gary.
Yeah, we have to pay as much as the women.
Two candidates, Sarah Lloyd from her mailing address is Wisconsin Dells, and Michael Slattery from Maribel, which I think is near Manitowoc, are vying for the 6th Congressional District Democratic spot on the November 8 ballot. You can tell how widespread, how far-flung this 6th district is by where they live, one on each end of the district. It includes the counties of Columbia, Marquette, Waushara, Green Lake, part of Dodge, Winnebago, part, Fond du Lac, Manitowoc, Sheboygan, part of Milwaukee, and Ozaukee. Republican Glenn Grothman and Independent Jeff Dahlke will be invited to join the winner of this August 9 Democratic primary for a forum in October prior to the November 8 election. Our timekeeper will give you cues. You would thank you in advance for keeping your answers short so we may cover as many issues as possible. Audience questions are welcome. Please submit them in writing to the League representative who will be circulating up and down the aisles. Candidates received the first two questions in advance. First, we will hear 1-minute opening statements. We're doing this alphabetically. Tell us about your qualifications and why you are seeking election to the U.S. House of Representatives. We'll begin with Sarah Lloyd.
Thank you, and thanks very much to the League of Women Voters for hosting this forum. I am a strong believer in small d democracy, so I really appreciate the opportunity and for everyone who came out tonight. A little bit about me. My husband and I are dairy farmers, and we are outside of the Dells in the town of Newport. We milk and run the business with his family, the Nelson family, and I work off the farm, as a lot of farm families do, send someone off the farm to get health insurance. I work for the Farmers Union on cooperative business development and building better markets for farmers. I have experience at the local level. I was elected to 2 terms on the county board in Columbia County, and I was appointed in 2013 to the National Dairy Board by the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. I've also worked internationally in Russia, Sweden, and Finland on forest management and timber issues. I'm running because the economy is out of balance, and we need an economy that will work for everyone.
Thank you. Michael Slattery.
I thank the League of Women Voters also, and my wife and I are longtime members of the League, and we're proud to be here. It's a great honor to be able to speak with you today. So what are my qualifications? That's what I was asked. I was, after high school, I was in the Jesuits for about 13 years. I do focus on social justice issues as well as service. I worked for 2 of the largest financial institutions in the world, in New York and in Tokyo, where I made an awful lot of things happen. I started new businesses for them. I understand accounting. I've worked extensively with both national and international issues with regard to tax, accounting, and finance. And the reasons that I'm running are the following. I wish to serve the people rather than having career politicians and professional politicians serving them. We have a paralysis and a inaction going on in Washington. This needs to be addressed. And I wish to assume leadership as opposed to simply having ideological polemic by our politicians put out. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, candidates received in advance, and this time you have 2 minutes. If you are elected, what will your priorities be as a representative for the 6th Congressional District? Well, this time we start with Michael Slattery.
I have a number of priorities, and they are the following. First of all is this issue of income maldistribution. Over the past 30, 40 years in this country, we've seen the bad effects of it. We have an undermining of our democracy. We have a free market system, and under the free market system, the only way that we can address that is through the tax system. This needs to be addressed. People in the upper income tax brackets are effectively not paying their fair share. People in the lower income tax brackets, they aren't paying anything because they aren't paid enough. So that's the first priority. Second priority has to do with the two of the three big expenditures of the federal government, and that's Social Security and Medicare. For Social Security, this can easily be resolved. Our politicians are not solving it. They're avoiding the whole issue. Medicare is more difficult to solve, but it needs to be dealt with. Our seniors depend upon it, as well as many invalids, as well as people that have had unfortunate incidences in their family, and this needs to be addressed. The third priority has to do with military expenditure. We are spending more in military expenditure than the next 24 countries combined. We have nothing to show for it. As a business person, I focus on results, and we are not getting the results there. So my objective would be to find people to align with to address this issue. And I am not opposed to the military, so don't get me wrong. The veterans, though, the veterans are not being served, and more expenditure, more services need to be provided to them. Three more things deal with infrastructure. Our infrastructure is dilapidated, it's antiquated, and we need to bring this up into the 21st century. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to compete. Next to last point is climate change. We deal with climate change every day. This is not being addressed by our Congress, and we need to address it. The final point is comprehensive immigration. We have 11.5 million people here that are undocumented, and we need to care for them. They are here largely because of U.S. foreign policy, what we have done in terms of trade in Mexico and Central America.
Thank you. Sarah, your turn.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the economy is going to be a main focus for me in Congress, and this income inequality, as Michael mentioned, as a business owner, farmer, we know that the economy is not working for us, and the federal government has the ability to make sure that the markets are not keeping small business owners out. Right now, in the agribusiness sector, we have massive monopoly power, and the U.S. government is not doing its job to make sure that the economy is fair for business owners. And that is something that I would call on the DOJ to actually take effect on, so that family farmers, small business owners, and working families can actually be supported by the economy. Another area that we have a real opportunity in right now is opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP is a trade deal, and we have not been served as small businesses, as working families, as communities by the past trade deals. We all remember the promises of NAFTA, of CAFTA, now we have TPP, and the alphabet soup that we have is not supporting our families. So we have a duty, and I will oppose the TPP, and we can find other ways to create jobs and not be dependent on these bad trade deals. So I agree with Michael, let's invest in our infrastructure. Roads, transportation, public transportation, we can really pump up the economy with that. And hey, I live in a rural area, I would like some broadband, please. We need to have comprehensive broadband that's accessible to everyone, because as a business owner, I can't run my business right now because I can't get access to high-speed internet, and it's a dampening the economy. Let's invest in quality public education, K-12, tech colleges to train our workers, and let's make college affordable. Those are big things that I will work on in Congress. And a basic infrastructure piece that we must pay attention to is clean water. This is the fundamental building block of our human lives, of our ecosystems, and we have to maintain and protect our clean water. And just quickly, as I sum up, We have the Affordable Care Act as a good building block, but let's expand on it. Let's make sure that people aren't falling into donut holes or payment gaps.
I think you've exceeded your time, and we have a
Okay.
question on that topic. that
Okay,
we will-
I'll
we
get
will,
back to that then,
ask.
thanks.
Thank you. Gary has the first question.
The first question that comes from the audience, and that is, what do you believe is the major, and they underline major, difference between you and your opponent?
This is Sarah's question
Okay.
first.
Well, thank you for that question. And Michael and I know each other. We work together on cooperative development and farmers union projects. And the difference that I would talk about to the voters is that I have been running a very strong campaign. I started out in March, out on doors, talking to people, and I can differentiate myself from the incumbent, Glenn Grothman, and run a very strong campaign that is resourced so that we can run the campaign that we need to defeat Glenn Grothman in November.
Michael.
Okay. Sarah and I are friends. We've known each other for 8 years. But the basic differences between us are the following. I come out of business and I come from farming. I actually do the farming. My wife and I have farmed for the past 17 years. I was farming today, and farming I love very much. I am a business person. I do get things done. I have decades of expertise and experience in business, both internationally as well as nationally, dealing with municipal finance, what have you. My focus is that as a business person, I have a business discipline. I get things done on a timely basis. I focus on solving problems, and I move on to the next issue. I'm not an academic, although I do teach business courses in master's programs. But I am a person who does the farming and who does business. And that's what I hope to bring if I am elected, to some business discipline to Washington, which is not occurring.
Okay. Frankie, you have a question.
I do. And you both mentioned the Affordable Care Act. And so I'm going to narrow in on that. What changes would you like to see in it? Should drug prices be negotiated for Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA clients? And anything else that you think should be done to improve the Affordable Care Act?
And Michael's question first.
Yeah, thank you. The Affordable Care Act is the best that we have now. And it is rather strange that the Veterans Affairs is able to negotiate discount prices based on volume for drugs, but Medicare cannot. This is a real weakness in this, and it's the Congress which has sort of undermined the power of the Affordable Care Act. There is the issue of the donut hole. The Affordable Care Act really, the Affordable Care Act really doesn't go far enough. What we really need is a single-payer system in this country, and I think that's what we should be working for. If we do work for that, the biggest issue has to do with employment. You know, what do you do with all these insurance companies that have these adjusters? I think they could easily be assumed by Medicare, and that's what we should be working for. Instead of the 20 to 30% overhead that we see in the private sector for insurance companies, if you have Medicare, they run a 3 to 4% overhead. So we should be working towards that. And but what we have now, this is the best we have, and for attempting to vote it down 64 times is a waste of our taxpayer money that the Congress is engaging in.
Okay, thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, so I would agree. The Affordable Care Act is here. We worked hard politically to get that in place, but it's not enough. I have been talking to many, many people in the district as I am knocking on doors and meeting people in their communities, and the access to affordable health care is still one of the main issues that I hear about. It's impacting people. They're falling into these gaps in the coverage, or they're transferring into retirement, and they're very unsure. We must be able to negotiate drug prices. It's, as Michael said, the fact that the VA can do it but Medicare can't doesn't make any sense, so we need to change that. I support a transition over time to a single-payer system. Medicare for all. That makes the most sense. It's the most efficient way to do it, and it will cover the most people. Healthcare should be a right. It is a fundamental right. It's not something that should be in the economic market.
Thank you. Gary, it's your question.
What are your thoughts on the national minimum wage? If we have one, how much do you think it should be?
And this is Sarah's question.
So I support the current push for a $15 minimum wage. I support that because we obviously need to get something done. And how are we going to do it? We need to pull together a coalition of workers, of farmers. I want workers to be paid a decent wage because I need you to buy my milk. And so you can't do that if you're not making enough money to support your family and to be out buying things in the grocery store and in the stores. And that's the way our economy works. So we need people to have good wages that can support their families. And $15 is a good start. It may be too low in some places, it may be too high in others, but let's all come together and push this through so we can support our families.
Thank you. Michael.
I look at it a little bit differently. What I would like to push for is a living wage, not just a minimum wage. And the living wage differs significantly. If you live in New York or you live in San Francisco, $15 really isn't enough. If you live in Wisconsin, maybe $15 is too much. So how do you address this? I think the way to address it is to have a weighted average wage that applies throughout each state. And each state would determine with the federal government what is the appropriate level of a wage. $7.25 doesn't cut it for anyone, even if you're living at home. So this needs to be addressed. Now, if you address it by a $15 wage at the start, that's fine, but it just simply isn't enough. And I think we should look with more research and more analytics in what is the appropriate wage by region. I think that makes more sense.
I want to remind the audience that we welcome audience questions. Please submit them in writing to the League representative, and we will try to use them. Frankie, it's your question.
Okay, I'm going to switch to student debt. A lot of people think that student debt is a problem. What would you like to see happen in this regard? Do you favor your standard bearer's call for free tuition?
And that's Michael's question.
Okay. So student debt is the two principal debts that we are experiencing in the country are home mortgages and student debt. The drag on the economy, why we could not get out of the Great Recession, was largely due to the tremendous level of student debt that is being carried. Students are now, or graduates are now living at home. They're working outside. They are not buying cars. They are not renting apartments. They are not building houses. This is a drag on the economy. So this has to be dealt with. Then, do I favor 0% debt? No, I don't. Why? I think a student needs some sort of skin in the game. If they've got skin in the game, they will work harder for it. And it's not just a welfare. Now, what is the appropriate level that the student debt? When it takes the federal government 1.48% for a 10-year treasury, they should be able to finance student debt at that level, because that is being on lent through the banks or financial institutions or through the Department of Education to students, and that's an appropriate level that they could pay.
Sarah.
So student debt is a very important issue. First of all, for folks that currently have student loans, they must be able to renegotiate those loans. It is ridiculous that we've let this go on so long, that we have this very high interest rate for student loans, and yet I can go out and get a car loan or a loan for a home at a much lower rate. So we have to be able to renegotiate student loans. And then, as Michael said, we look at the way that young people, as they're coming out of college, in the past, they were part of the drivers of the economy. They were going out, they were buying houses, they were furnishing houses, they were buying cars, and they are not able to do that because of the fact that their loans are so high and the rates are so high on the interest. So as far as whether or not I support free tuition, I would like to see public universities be affordable and that we can open it up to have low tuitions, especially for in-state students at public universities.
Thank you. Gary, it's your question.
Okay. I'm sure you can guess what some of these are going to be. Would you change the national gun laws in any way? Do you support legislation that would require background checks for all gun sales? For example, recent polls show that approximately 85% of Wisconsinites support background checks.
And this is Sarah's question.
Okay. So yes, this is very important. What should we do about guns? We must be able to have sensible gun laws and reduce gun violence. We have to do that as a community. We have to come together. My husband's family, we hunt. We have guns in our home. Of course, guns for recreation, guns for personal safety are fine, but we have to have uniform background checks. We must close the loopholes at gun shows and the internet. And I would be in favor of limiting access to these assault-style weapons with large capacity magazines.
Michael.
I support the Second Amendment. It is very important for us in this country. However, at the time the Second Amendment was formulated was totally different historic circumstances as well as cultural circumstances that we experience now. I have two guns in our home. One is a single-shot shotgun, which I use on vermin as well as diseased wildlife. I have a .22, which I also borrowed from a neighbor to handle animals that were trapped in a cage that are destroying our crops, etc. So I am opposed to these military attack weapons. There is no need for that. I am also, we need background checks for absolutely everything, for private sales, for gun sales, etc. This is absolutely essential. And if there is some sort of mental problem of the individual purchasing the gun, then some sort of further check needs to occur before allowing the sale of those guns, because most guns that are used in these mass shootings, etc., many of the people have mental issues.
Thank you. Frankie, your question.
This is an audience question. How do you differentiate yourself from the Republican representative for this district?
And that's Michael's question first.
Okay, I don't think it's really my question, but Sarah and I, we are pretty much in the same ballpark. Okay, so major points of distinction. First point is Mr. Grothman, for 18 months while he was in Congress, we never heard anything from him. Suddenly in the past 3-4 weeks, it's every other day we're getting some sort of expensive literature or email from him. And what is it that he is focusing on? One is right to life, but I don't believe that he's really right to life. Why? Because he supports increased military expenditure. He does nothing about raising the minimum wage, nothing about affordable housing. He's voted against the Affordable Care Act. So that's not right to life. Second point is that he stresses his relationship with seniors. But he's done nothing whatsoever about addressing, shoring up the Social Security Trust Fund, nor Medicare. And these are issues and important services that the federal government provides that he is not addressing. My time's up. Thanks.
Sarah.
I could go on.
Yeah, we could go on. So how do I differentiate myself from Glenn Grothman? Well, it's pretty easy. Glenn Grothman has been in Congress now, and as Michael said, we didn't hear much from him. He hasn't done anything there. He's sponsored few, if any, bills, and has not been an effective representative for us here. And he's not been effective in most of his political life because he's not representing the values of our community and our families. If you look at Glenn Grothman's record over time as an elected official, he goes out of his way to come down on single mothers, on children who need assistance with free and reduced lunch, and he's actually taken that into the federal Congress. The one amendment that he put forward was to make it more difficult for schools to offer free and reduced lunch to their children. And this is exactly the time when we should be investing in our children and in our communities. And that's how I differentiate myself from Glenn Grothman, is that I will invest in our communities and in our families, and he is not doing that.
Gary, do you have a question?
Yes, this is another audience question, and I'm going to read it verbatim. We all know what needs to be done, but more examples on how you can break the gridlock or bridge the gap between parties is what we would like to hear.
And that's Sarah to start with.
Yes, so we do know that Congress is gridlocked. We know that the incumbent is part of the obstructionist game that's being played, where they're not putting anything through, where they're voting time and time again to end the Affordable Care Act. And how are we going to break through that? Well, let's take some things that we know that we can get movement on. So I talked earlier about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We see that the trade deals, finally, after people concerned about NAFTA and concerned about what these so-called free trade deals were doing to our communities, to our workers, to our family farmers, finally we're seeing that on both sides of the partisan divide, people are understanding that the economy is undermining our families and communities. And so let's take TPP, let's work on that. I will get into Congress and start there and build some support on both sides of the aisle to build an economy that's actually going to work for people. Michael.
I worked in business for 18 years in New York and Tokyo. I worked with all sorts of people that that I found personally morally reprehensible, people that were totally different characters than myself. But things need to get done. So I am a person that was able to build alliances with people, find people that have the skills and the traits that you need in order to advance projects, or in this case it would be bills along. And I would engage in civilly relating with people, building these alliances, building compromises and negotiating in order to get things done. And I'm not really interested in partisan politics at all. I'm interested in issues and getting results of the issues that I think are important. And it's finding the people that have similar values, similar feelings, and working with them to advance them along.
Frankie, it's your question.
I'm going to ask a question on climate change. I get the Sunday New York Times, and the article last week on islands disappearing in Chesapeake Bay is just awful. So what do you think should be the role of the U.S. government in addressing climate change?
And this is Michael's question.
Climate change is something that I personally involved in farming deal with every day. Our growing season is longer, planting season is starting earlier, and the harvest is later. We're getting heavier downpours in the spring, and the droughts that we are tending to experience in August, September are deeper and longer. So this is real. We are experiencing it. And what occurred at in Paris with the climate accord simply didn't go far enough. We have islands that are disappearing, not just in Chesapeake Bay, but in the Pacific, where whole peoples will have to move. They will have to change their lives. This affects our children and our children's future. And we have 3 children, and we have 2 grandchildren, and I'm concerned about the world that they will live in. If we do not address this now, if we do not reduce the hydrocarbons, if we do not reduce the amount of environmental degradation that we have going on, we will have increased wars, we will have food scarcity, we will have droughts and famines, things like that. So this is real, and we need to address it now. We cannot wait.
Sarah.
I share Michael's passion for addressing climate change and the role of the federal government. We have a couple areas that I would concentrate on. Let's use the resources of the federal government to get us off our addiction to fossil fuels. Our economy is overly dependent on fossil fuels, and we have an opportunity to make a change and use the resources of the federal government to give incentives to businesses, to municipalities, to individuals. We have programs right now with the USDA Rural Energy for America that gives incentives to private individuals and to businesses to put up solar installations, and that's also can be a job creator. So let's build that into the way that we revitalize our economy by concentrating on solar. Also, let's honor our international commitments to be part of the climate change solution with our allies, with the North and the South. That is important, and let's expand the international agreements and actually abide by them and be the leader that we are in the world.
Gary, it's your question.
There's an audience question here that I'm going to tie in with another thing. You both call yourself farmers. What do you think about federal agricultural policy, and what changes would you make? And I think the audience question would tie into this, and that is, what's your opinion of the current ethanol mandate?
And this is Sarah's question.
Okay. So federal ag policy. One important thing that Congress does is negotiate the Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill is starting to be renegotiated. So I will be a strong voice for family farmers at the table, but I'll also be a strong voice for eaters. Because a big thing about the Farm Bill is that it has to do with what kind of food and fiber is produced and how we get it to consumers. And so right now, as a dairy farmer, I have been operating at a loss for over a year because of the way that the federal pricing structure for dairy is set up. And they messed it up. They took away the milk income loss program and they put in this margin protection program. For the taxpayer, it was good because it actually, I pay money in as a premium, an insurance premium, that's supposed to help me when the price becomes low. But guess what? The formulas weren't written right. I'm getting no support despite the fact that we have drastically low prices. And so we have to, that's an emergency action that must be taken because the dairy state is losing all of its family farmers. So that would be actually be my number one priority.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's important. I don't like to cut you off. Michael.
Okay, you got 2 questions here. The first question is farm legislation. Farm legislation in 2018, a new farm bill will be renegotiated and reissued. On the farm subsidy, there are real issues there. So if you wish to preserve the small and medium-sized farm, you're going to have to limit the amount of subsidies that are going to larger farmers. $750,000 adjusted gross income just doesn't cut it with unlimited amount of subsidy that you can get from the federal government. This is the wrong way to go about it. Second point on farm legislation pertains to conservation. When the Conservation Stewardship Program or Conservation Reserve Program gets reduced funding, this is hurting our environment and it is hurting our farming as well as destroying our environment. This needs to be dealt with. Last point, ethanol, there are no subsidies anymore. The blender's credit went away. We still have the mandate, though, and the mandate is that a certain number of gallons, and I can't remember what it is, but that's that 10% ethanol that you got there. If you remove that, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City several months ago said that if you remove that, roughly 15 to 20% of the farmers in the Corn Belt will be bankrupt. You cannot do that. And this is one way that we can address this issue of hydrocarbons.
Thank you. Very interesting. Frankie, your question.
This is still environmental. What is your position on fracking?
And that's Michael's question.
So fracking, while we think this is relatively new, when I was in finance, this was going on in Venezuela and Colombia. This is not a new practice. But the issue of fracking is not the technology itself, but the chemicals that are being used. There's something like 200, 250 different types of chemicals. Many of them are toxic and carcinogens that are being used. If this enters the aquifers, which it may, if you do not have responsible drillers there, then how do you get this out of your aquifers? You can't. It is there for centuries. So fracking is a mixed bag. Yeah, in the western part of the state, we're producing frac sand that is going not just to the Bakken fields, but also to the Middle East now. And that may be a reduction in their employment there. But the greater issue is the environmental degradation that occurs from fracking. And whether you control that through more stringent control of the drilling or whether you outlaw it needs to be researched further.
Thank you. Sarah.
So with regards to fracking, I mentioned in one of the opening questions that clean water is a priority for me. And it is too dangerous to mess around with poisoning our aquifers. We have to get off of fossil fuels, including natural gas, and fracking is not worth the risk to me. So I would support banning fracking going forward because we are seeing impacts in communities all across the U.S. and internationally, and it's not worth the risk. Because if we poison our water, we're never going to get that back.
We have time for one more question, panel, and I think it's Gary's question. A quick one, hopefully.
Well, okay. There are two ways to balance a budget. By reducing spending or by increasing revenues. As I'm sure you're all aware, both the federal deficit and the total federal debt continue to increase. What would be your approach to this?
This is not quick, but please, just 1 minute each, please,
Okay.
because then we have time for closing. And it's Sarah's question.
Yes. So we are often given this choice about how to balance the budget. And we're always told, well, we're broke and we can't have any more programs and we can't do things. But we aren't broke, we just have our priorities wrong on a lot of things. So let's reduce spending strategically in military spending. Let's make sure that everyone is paying their fair share of taxes. We have loopholes where multinationals are not paying their fair share. We have Wall Street speculators that are making billions and billions of dollars with no taxation. So we can increase revenue, but not on the backs of the middle class, not on the backs of our families and communities. And let's be smart about our spending.
Michael.
Okay, the question pertains to debt, and I come out of finance, so this is not an either-or. This is not reducing expenditure and increasing revenue. You may have to increase revenue. People don't like to say it. Politicians may cut their throat by saying you're going to have to raise taxes. But as a business person, you may have to raise revenue, and you have to find ways to cut expenditure. Now, the debt level, which is what the question pertains to, what is the appropriate debt level of the country? Right now, we're operating at about 102% of our GDP. That really is too much. And we're going to have to work to get it down. However, you can do this very astutely. The Federal Reserve, instead of funding through T-bills, they should be funding in long-term debt. Why? Because that will reduce the interest costs and lock in those lower interest rates going into the future. And this is one of the ways that we can deal with it while we are reducing the debt. The debt, though, is also a factor of the economy. If the economy is not expanding, you are not going to get the revenue. And you're going to have to deal with this. My time is up. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. It's now time for closing statements, and you may each have 1 minute to make a closing statement. And I think it's Michael's turn to go first.
I thank everyone for coming out today. This is a very important election. We hear politicians say that all the time, but running this time, I believe it. I feel it very deeply in my heart. I am running to win. I'm not running to educate on issues. I am not running for advocacy. We need to address the malaise, the paralysis, and the inaction that we are seeing in D.C. at this time. And I feel that I have the experience, the expertise, and the traits to be able to deal with this should you elect me at the primary. I also feel that I am best suited to be able to compete against Mr. Grothman. As a business person, I bring a business aspect and discipline, as well as a knowledge in finance and farming and fiscal matters that would be very beneficial in Washington.
Thank you. Sarah Lloyd.
Thanks so much to the panel, to the League of Women Voters, and to Oshkosh Media for having this forum. This is very important. Certainly, as you consider who to vote for in the August 9th primary, you need to consider which candidate meets your political ideals or as close to your views as possible. But I have the experience in elected government. So I have been on the Columbia County Board, I am on the National Dairy Board, and I bring that to the table, and I will bring that to Washington. As far as who can beat Glenn Grothman, we know it's not going to be easy. This district is drawn in a way that it's very beneficial to the Republicans, but I have been out running hard, direct voter contact, bringing together resources from supporters in the district to build a campaign, to hire staff, to get out there and run the campaign that needs to be run in order to beat Glenn Grothman. And his viewpoints on families, on women, are unacceptable, and I am the candidate that can push that and beat him in November. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This concludes the forum for the 6th Congressional District Democratic Party partisan primary. A reminder, on August 9, you must vote a partisan ballot for the political party of your choice. We will resume in a few moments with the Republican candidates for Winnebago County Register of Deeds. Let's give them a round of applause.